Good evening, everyone. My name is Thane Rosenbaum. I'm the creative director of the Forum on Life, Culture, and Society at Touro College, and welcome to yet another one of our virtual live stream events that we're hosting during this pandemic. And tonight is a very special night because we're introducing a very new series, and this is our very first installment of it, and we expect it to go on for some time. It's the FOLCS Conversations on Essential Cinema. It's in partnership with the New York Film Academy. What can I tell you? FOLCS is now going art house. We've always given you more recent films and some other classic films, but we've never done anything quite like this. This is essentially, if you stick with this program, you'll receive an MFA in film studies from FOLCS University. The board of directors from FOLCS will send you a certificate. It's that kind of series. It'll be entertaining and smart as always. We're interested, as usual, the big ideas of the day and of prior days. We're interested in the aesthetics of these films and the cultural significance of them and the way they fall into the history of cinema. What that essentially means that we will not be showcasing any of the Avengers films or Justice League, no Aquaman, no Anchorman, but not even the first installment of Batman with Michael Keaton. These are just serious films, foreign films, films from Sweden, Italy, France, the Great Britain, and some of the true classics that were made in the United States, both independently and some, many like this one, very much sort of outside the pure Hollywood system. And featuring, to kick off our series, we're going to have Annette Insdorf, who is, many of you may know, there she is, there's Annette. Annette is a longtime professor of film studies at Columbia University. She is adored by students, and there's no doubt many of her former students are watching this evening. She hosts Real Pieces, that series at the 92nd Street Y, in which she watches brand new films, screens with her audience, and then has an interview with either director or the cast from the film. She's written books on Truffaut and Kieślowski and Philip Hoffman. She's also the author of what was no question, the definitive book on Holocaust films called Indelible Shadows, Holocaust and Film. And so when we reached out to Annette, she was an easy choice. She's so well known in the film community. She and I are also very longtime friends. And honestly, I don't know anybody, honestly, that I hold in much greater esteem for the quality of her mind and the generosity of her heart than the great Annette Insdorf. So when we asked her to be our very first guest, we said, pick your film. And of course, she picked The Pawnbroker, a film that she will talk about with me for the next hour. We'll take some questions from you at the end. In her book, Indelible Shadows, she speaks about The Pawnbroker and teaches it. This is a film, a go-to film for her. It's also a significant film for us for another reason. It's a film that was directed by Sidney Lumet. Sidney Lumet has had a long history with FOLCS. He was a guest. There he is. There's a laughing Sidney. It wasn't very hard to get Sidney to laugh. It was a very jovial character, and that picture went by very fast. I love that groovy shirt I was wearing. There, see that? It was a groovy shirt. Sidney was, again, our guest 3 different times and was a friend of FOLCS. And let me give you one quick anecdote. I don't know if Annette knows this. I don't know if she was there that night when we hosted Supreme Court Justice Sonia Sotomayor as to be part of our film series. And she picked Sidney's first feature, 12 Angry Men. It was featured on the front page of the Metro section of the New York Times. And Sidney was very excited about this. The Supreme Court Justice of the United States is going to talk about his first film. And he was supposed to be there that night. He was supposed to be in the front row. But he had gotten sick and he couldn't make it. And I'll never forget that Sonia Sotomayor at some point said to the audience, "Isn't Sidney Lumet here?" And I turned to her and I said, "No, he's actually not well. He's in hospital." And she turned to me and the audience, she said, "Well, maybe we should go visit him." And I actually thought, this is a very different kind of Supreme Court justice, a woman of true heart, that we would virtually all go to the hospital. So anyway, we miss Sidney, but here's another way of honoring him. With Annette Insdorf to discuss The Pawnbroker. Annette, so thankful that you are our first guest.
I'm very glad to be here, and I appreciate the very kind words you've just said about me, Thane.
Well, they're as you know, I love you and they're genuine. Annette, you know, since this is Folks University, I just deemed it. The board of directors are probably freaking out right now. We're not a university. Uh, Now that we're actually going art house, and that the aspiration here is to give people a sense that they've touched film school in some way. I'm actually interested in the context of the film before we even get into it, like where it falls in the history of cinema. My understanding, I could be wrong, is that it fit into sort of this New York school or a New York genre of filmmakers. And we're going to show you some of those films. That's on the waterfront, films from the late 1950s, 1960s. That's Scorsese's Mean Streets. That's Schlesinger's Midnight Cowboy. There's Friedkin's French Connection, and of course Scorsese's Raging Bull. Oh yes, and Sidney Lumet's Dog Day Afternoon with Al Pacino, who was just about to scream the word Attica. So that my understanding was that The Pawnbroker was one of the signature early films that led to this genre. So maybe you can talk about the genre itself, its significance, why it was important to the extent at which it was, and then whether I'm even right that this film, in fact, ended up inspiring the directors that wound up making films throughout the 1970s.
Oh, absolutely. I mean, it sort of began already a bit earlier with Jules Dassin's Naked City, and then Elia Kazan in the 50s with On the Waterfront. And by the time that Sidney Lumet made 12 Angry Men, there was already the possibility of an East Coast cinema, an anti-Hollywood kind of aesthetic that would make the very streets and rhythms of our city part of that cinematic experience. And one name I should invoke that's not in your images, John Cassavetes.
Of course.
He was perhaps even more important because he did it first. Shadows was his first feature in 1959, black and white, jazz score, but also jazz images in terms of the rhythms of the interaction of characters, a biracial love story. You know, he was treading new ground. In 1963, when The Pawnbroker was being made, the reality is that no studio wanted to take this on. It was Eli Landau, a name that is rarely invoked that I now increasingly feel has to be celebrated because he was the first, in a way, of the great independent producers committed to a New York cinema that had very different looks and values from polished Hollywood product. He took it on when nobody else would. Sidney Lumet was not the original director. He came in like 2 weeks before they were supposed to film. Apparently, Rod Steiger was the only definite one cast, and they did a whole lot of last-minute casting. But what's crucial, that there are a few things, actually. There are direct connections visually to, let's say, On the Waterfront, because Boris Kaufman was the cinematographer for both Kazan and for Lumet with The Pawnbroker. Jazz that I just invoked with Cassavetes. Well, guess what? The Pawnbroker was the first score composed by Quincy Jones for film. He would go on to become one of the major figures in music and film. There are many elements in this movie that were not being tackled as honestly in Hollywood movies, like race. I mean, the very fact that you understand how New York is filled with different ethnicities, often at war with one another. But the most important aspect for me that I'm sure we're going to talk about, nobody was making films about Holocaust survivors in 1963. And the fact that it wasn't released till 1965 is another issue that perhaps we'll get into later. But the very notion that you could make an entire film based on a relatively unsympathetic character. Thane, I know that in the documentary by Sidney Lumet, which you were very much involved in, Lumet acknowledged, and in other interviews, like in Imaginary Witness, Hollywood and the Holocaust, directed by Danny Anker, that the guy's a bastard. Sol Nazerman is not meant to be cuddly. And Rod Steiger plays him to perfection with that imploding, repressed energy. Don't forget that at this point in time, what had Hollywood done vis-a-vis the Holocaust? The Diary of Anne Frank, Judgment at Nuremberg, safe, adapted from other media, not really challenging the viewer very much in terms of audience identification. And along comes The Pawnbroker, this chiseled portrait of a survivor in New York City, capturing the contemporary rhythms, the way that, for example, the boss, his boss, is
Yeah,
black.
we'll get to that.
Yeah, so all of this was true to New York at that moment and radically different from whatever else was happening in Hollywood.
So before, I neglected to tell the audience a little bit before we started that if you wanted to leave comments on the bottom of your screen, there's a comment section. And of course, press the Q&A button, and we'll hope to take some of your questions for Annette at the very end. I was so excited to get to the Pawnbroker with Annette that I forgot to tell you about how you ask questions here tonight. But I think something else I want to say about this New York film genre that I feel is important and that the Pawnbroker fits nicely into is that when we talk about anti-Hollywood, among other things, of course, streets, right? Streets were important. Urban, gritty was important, but also not Hollywood endings. Not life-affirming happy endings, very ambiguous, morally ambiguous endings. To me, that's a very important piece of what I think is distinctive about that the New York school, whatever the school or filmmakers, because all of those films that we just discussed, they end very ambivalently and not happily in many cases. Certainly the Pawnbroker doesn't. Very much an ambivalent ending. We don't know what Saul's doing when he's walking down 116th Street. We don't know after Jesus's death, what's Pawnbroker 2 alike? Is Saul going to start to live? Or it will be impossible for Saul to live. So I think it's perfect that the New York filmmaking, that aesthetic was attached to the story, because it shouldn't have a happy ending, right? Not in 1964, 20 years after the liberation of Auschwitz. Why should it have a happy ending? So I think that to me is somewhat important. And also, usually in these films, you don't see Hollywood handsome people. And it's not just that he was an unsympathetic character. I mean, when I think of the New York those films, I think about how people like De Niro and Pacino probably wouldn't have had a career if it wasn't for these films. They weren't good looking enough. Hoffman and Pacino aren't even tall enough, right? All of this, Rod Steiger, look at Hackman, ordinary looking men. These are not, there's no look at that. There's no Cary Grant anywhere. And I think as you know, I'm not into these anecdotes, you're much better at this, but Steiger goes on a run in the mid 1960s, right? By the way, he's in On the Waterfront, right? He plays Charlie, Brando's older brother, but he has look at this 3-year run, The Pawnbroker, Dr. Zhivago, and In the Heat of the Night, 1, 2, 3, right? And I think he wins an Academy Award. I think he's nominated for The Pawnbroker, and he wins for In the Heat of the Night. I'm not even sure, when people think about really great Hollywood careers, that alone, those 3 films alone are extraordinary. So I'm still, before we get into the Pawnbroker, I want to get into just one more thought about what was really truly unique about it. That it fits into this category. What about this idea that you said before about a Holocaust survivor in 1964? I have something to add to this. I don't even think that the word Holocaust survivor even was a phrase in 1964. We say it now, but remember Mrs. Birchfield in the film, all she says in Marcus Garvey Park, it's my favorite scene in the movie, by the way, when she invites him to lunch on a sort of date, and Saul, of course, would not know what a date is, and nor would he go to one. And she says, remember, in there is an extraordinary moment. She says this, I'll never forget this. She says something like, oh no, this is before the date. In the pawn shop, she says, you were in one of those camps. That's it. That's all that needs to be said, right? That I'm just wondering, you're right, after Anne Frank, there's not that much information in 1964 about the Holocaust. There's still an enormous amount of silence. And Anne Frank, in my mind, has almost nothing to do with the Holocaust. So this film really, the other film I always was thinking about is, Kirk Douglas did that film in the mid-50s called The Juggler. But was there ever any other film actually about a Holocaust survivor?
Not by the time that The Pawnbroker was made that I know of. And you're raising, two different issues, but we don't have time for me to take the first one on. There is an entire sort of context of the development of the American male protagonist. In the 1950s, it started being burst open by Marlon Brando, also Montgomery Clift and James Dean, the underbelly, the repressed stuff that Hollywood was not really dealing with up until that point.
But those were Hollywood films, right?
Right, but it was starting to change even in Hollywood, thanks to people like Elia Kazan. He directed all three of them.
Right.
And then by the time that you get to the 60s, don't forget, things were changing in that decade in a pretty radical way. I remember my husband, Mark, pointed out to me that it was a time when we were moving away from the traditional Western, let's say The Searchers,
Yeah.
to something like Midnight Cowboy. In other words, there was a completely sort of a swerve to a much different sense of what a cowboy is and what a hero is. And New York was part of that. Oh, also a tiny detail that your audience might want to know. It was in 1966, 1 year after the release of The Pawnbroker, that then Mayor John Lindsay created the mayor's office on film, which became the mayor's office on film and television, essentially turning our city into cinematic terrain. Now, this had already been done by the pioneers. Kazan, and of all people, Lumet deserves the most credit. I consider Lumet to be the poet of New York streets. He did it in Dog Day Afternoon, in Serpico, in Prince of the City. And even though the streets are pretty gritty in The Pawnbroker, they are so expressive. And the way that, well, I don't want to jump ahead because we're talking about something else, but the way that he shoots interiors, like the pawn shop with the grills, the fences, the composition that entraps.
Did we show that photo yet? I don't know. Olivia, we give that photo yet? I'm not sure if we did. The pawn shop shadows. Go ahead, Annette. Sorry.
No, it's quite all right. Boris Kaufman's cinematography, that shot tells you the story of a man who is imprisoned by his past, by his repressed memories. And one of the reasons I teach The Pawnbroker every year in my classes at Columbia is that it is one of the first examples, certainly one of the first in American movies, of stream of consciousness, where involuntary memory is what structures our entry into the mind of the character and into the action of the film. So the work of Ralph Rosenblum, the editor, of Boris Kaufman, the cinematographer, of Quincy Jones, the composer, of Rod Steiger, the star, and of Sidney Lumet, these are people working at the very top of their craft.
Right. Now, so let's talk a little about the portrait here of a Holocaust film before there was a word, the Holocaust, set in Harlem, right? Set in Harlem. There's only really one Jewish character. The film is filled with, other than his in-laws in Long Island, there's really, film is filmed with pimps and drug lords and, petty thieves. What makes this, it must have been like in some ways sort of a shock to the system that this was a film that was telling a Jewish story of some kind. And I think it was telling it in a way, and you mentioned a moment ago about Ralph Rosenblum, I think he was your colleague, something extraordinarily unique, which at the time, really, I don't think ever happened before, which was, again, this is 20 years after Auschwitz. Sol is the whole, the tenor of the film is based on it. There's an anniversary coming up. What was it, August 25th or September 20 something?
September.
And that, and I always assumed that date was the date of the picnic in Poland. That was what that, I don't know what it was. By the way, in case people are not aware, The Pawnbroker, this is my novelist hat talking. The Pawnbroker was first a novel by Edward Lewis Walland. And it was, in fact, nominated for a National Book Award. It did not win. And then it was adapted. So, you know, again, it was a critically acclaimed novel, and it picked up some of these themes. But what is really remarkable is that the film is capturing the 20 years anniversary of the sort of his quote unquote liberation from having lost a daughter, a son. His wife is turned into a prostitute in the camps. And for the first time, perhaps he's starting to remember it. So can you talk a little about that process of how that is being depicted in the film?
Yes, I'm going to try to do it succinctly because I could talk about it for half an hour. There are, after all, 5 flashback sequences in the film. But basically, his memories are triggered initially, almost imperceptibly. The first time that you actually are aware that there's a flash, well, I'm calling it a flash cut as opposed to a flashback.
Does it have a term of art? Like at the time when the reviewers wrote about it, did they know what to call it?
I'm not sure, but if I'm not mistaken, Ralph Rosenblum, in his wonderful book called When the Shooting Stops, the Cutting Begins, I think he uses flash cut as the term. It's when Sol's sister-in-law in that suburban setting says, 25 years, Sol, and we have this very quick subliminal cut of a woman with dark hair waving, and then back to Sol. We do not yet know at the beginning of the film that this is the first flash cut. And then it's when Sol at night is leaving his pawn shop, he sees kids beating up a young black kid on a...
It's also the sound of it with the barking dog, I think is a very important thing. And also the New York fences, right? New York, the way playgrounds are fenced off, right? I think all of that is supposed to evoke something.
Right. But as Lumet so articulately explained in the documentary Imaginary Witness, Hollywood and the Holocaust, he tried to think of how his own mind works if he's trying to repress something. It'll come in spurts, like first it'll be half a second, then a second and a half, then 2 seconds. That is what we see in the first major flashback and then in the others as well. Because Sol is fighting the memory, it doesn't simply flow in, it sputters in. So you have somebody who is so traumatized by what he experienced and all that he lost that he does not want to remember the past. Well, good luck. The past is going to come flooding in whether he wants it or not. And to the notion of what exactly is the anniversary, I'm always aware watching the film that the calendar that he refuses to allow anyone to switch from like September 29th to October 3rd, it also coincides with what is usually the Jewish high holy days, including Yom Kippur, the day when you're supposed to do no work, no signing, no nothing. And when he keeps repeating, no papers will be signed today. I can't help but feel that there's a kind of subtle evocation.
Wow. I never noticed that. Annette, I love that. I've always assumed it was the picnic, because to me, the picnic in Poland, when you see him holding his children and catching them in the air, and Poland never looked so good. You know, it was so pretty. And then all of a sudden, the barking dogs in the tank or whatever you see, and, you know, and the sounds of really the end of his life, right? As if that's the last day he was alive. So I've always wondered what that was, because, but the film though, it does seem like he wasn't. It seems to me that he wasn't actually experiencing the flash cuts before. The film makes you think that there's something now. I don't know. I find it really a dramatic concept that he was never ready in 1947, 1949, 1951. Something about the early 60s. There's a 20-year period goes by. And now he's feeling it again, as you point out, very imperceptibly at first. And then, as we remember in the film, eventually all the flash cuts become fully realized scenes, and we start to see them.
If you think back, though, to that opening sequence in Long Island, there are a couple of triggers, because his sister-in-law is asking, can't we go to Europe? And the very mention of returning to Europe is one kind of trigger. Then when her daughter runs out and pulls from Morton's hand the drawings of a naked woman and pushes it in front of Saul's face, who won't look at it, that's another trigger. For Saul, the image of a naked woman is charged.
Yes, good point.
And saying 25 years that Ruth is gone. So there are three triggers essentially at the very beginning, though we don't know it yet. And what's the next scene? He's driving into his pawn shop from Long Island, presumably. And with the credits, you have him walking past, it's a handheld shot, a storefront window piled high with shoes.
Oh, yeah, that's right.
Now, at the time in 1963, when they shot it, I don't think that meant what it means to us now. There's an entire sort of cinematic shorthand. There's an entire iconography of Holocaust representation. How today do you look at that shot and not superimpose the storehouses of Auschwitz? You can now even see the mountains of shoes, of suitcases, of hair.
Right.
So whether Lumet was conscious or not, he was already codifying certain Holocaust images. That would be another trigger for Saul, but he doesn't know it yet. Not in 63. We see it as a trigger when we watch the film today.
And you just reminded me, Annette, I wonder if you could respond to this. You know, I was reminded again of that schoolyard scene where Saul, he starts dropping his keys, he's sweating, you could see he's going through some kind of traumatic episode. There's another piece to it that I think is important, which was that it's not just, he remembers his friend Reuben, right? He remembers Reuben, who I guess is on the fence, electrocuted, as if he's trying to, right? I mean, if I remember, the helplessness of the boy screaming and the dogs barking are superimposed, the flash cut with Reuben essentially, I suspect, getting electrocuted on the fence.
Yes.
There's also something that's interesting that I think people don't pick up on. I don't know if you have to read the novel to know this. Tilly, who he's sleeping with, right?
Tessie.
Is Reuben's wife,
Tessie.
right? It's a very important point, right? He's sleeping with his best friend's wife, and the character who says, the old man, by the way, that's Sidney Lumet's father, Baruch Lumet, he put his father in a movie, who says, he says something like, Nazerman, the Walking Dead. Now that's something that had not been discussed either at the time. The idea of the walking, literally, now we have television shows about it, but the idea that a human being could be walking and still be dead, and that it's Tilly's father who, or Reuben's father, who points this out.
A couple of things. First of all, I think it's Tessie, and it's
Tessie.
Yeah, and it's Tessie's father, Mendel. And by the way, Baruch Lumet was an actor. He started out Yiddish theater, and Sidney Lumet started his career as a child actor in Yiddish. So there's a coherence there. When you mentioned, because I think the two things you just said are very much connected. When Saul sees the boys beating up another boy and suddenly flashes onto the concentration camp, that establishes his primary relationship to past and present. He is a helpless voyeur.
Excellent.
He is unable to do anything about Reuben's suffering. He's unable to do anything in the present tense as well. There's a sort of helpless passivity. All he can do is register, absorb whatever he's seeing, but he can't move forward.
And the best example of that, Annette, and the most horrifying one, I think, because as a man, you can't not understand this. When they smash his head through the window, where his basically say, look at your wife serving as a prostitute for the camp guards. Look at your wife, right? They smash his head into that. Again, how more helpless can a man be, right, than that?
The repeated word actually throughout the film, not just in that sequence, is look. It's just one word, look, which is, of course, an injunction to the spectator as well. But our voyeurism throughout The Pawnbroker is far from comfortable. When, for example, we see Mendel yelling The Walking Dead at Nazerman, we become aware of something that also didn't really exist in common parlance in 1963, but boy, does it exists now, and that's survivor guilt.
Ah,
This is one of the first cinematic portraits of this particular phenomenon, which, from what I
isn't that your
gather,
buddy Terence DePrey talked about that too?
Terence DePrey wrote what was for me one of the most important books about Holocaust representation, called The Survivor: An Anatomy of Life in the Death Camps. It was a book that affected me very deeply and partly inspired me to write my own book, Indelible Shadows: Film in the Holocaust. And I found Terence DePrey. I looked him up when I was about to write my book because I wanted to see what kind of a toll it took on a young scholar to immerse himself in Holocaust material.
And it's important to point out DePrey is not Jewish.
Not Jewish, but such a mensch,
Yeah.
somebody with a profound sensitivity and sympathy for all human beings. And I tracked him down in Cooperstown, New York. I remember my parents, Holocaust survivors, drove me. We all drove to meet him. And he was fantastic. And because I felt that he had not been scarred by his research and scholarship, I decided to write my book. So Terence DePrey does, of course, deal with survivor guilt, but as part of a much more vast canvas of exploration. But the question of survivor guilt is actually more problematic than we're going to have time to discuss today, because in my book, or at least the updated third edition from 2002, I added a section on the depiction of the Holocaust survivor as damaged goods, which is a problematic conceit. Certainly there have been emotionally wounded Holocaust survivors, but if my parents can be taken as any indication, some of the survivors were able to create new lives, to transcend whatever trauma existed, and to pass on to their children a surprisingly healthy and open and tolerant way of being in the world. So for dramatic purposes, the wounded survivor is powerful, but in the larger scheme of how survivors were and continue to be viewed in our society, you almost have to question it a little bit and say, not everybody turned out like that.
Right, but the dramatic possibilities are much stronger. I want to talk about a few scenes that I think are important and emblematic of some of the things that you just said. I was talking before about Mrs. Birchfield, and I said the lunch at Marcus Garvey Park, but then I realized I really meant at the pawn shop when she says, "Oh, you were in one of those camps," which sort of sets up for the audience something that, again, she doesn't say you were a Holocaust survivor, you were in one of those camps, which is supposed to all you need to know, and yet there's nothing there. There's not enough information because most people don't know by 1963 what this means. But there's an amazing scene in Marcus Garvey Park during the date where she, because she's a social worker, does what a social worker is supposed to do, which is to demonstrate she knows he's a broken man. And she wants to do what, in those days, certainly in the mid-60s, I suspect, was a very common practice in psychotherapy, which is the word empathy, right? The word empathy, you say, okay, here's how I can get to you. I'm going to tell you the worst thing that ever happened to me. And that way we will have a solidarity of suffering. And this to me was one of the most powerful scenes, I think, in film history, where she delivers this scene of a love lost, her husband dies, oh, it's this horrible story. And then he looks at her and he says, that was nothing, right? That's his response. That was nothing. And I think it's a very powerful scene. Again, when you talk about an unsympathetic character, right? If people aren't aware of what he's trying to say, he's saying, let me explain this to you. My son was suffocated in a cattle car. My daughter went up and smoked immediately after getting to the camps. My wife was turned into a prostitute at the camps for the guards. And my best friend was electrocuted on a fence. Really? Your husband died of cancer? That's the best you've got?
Well, I just pulled out a quotation because I love when my students teach me things that I hadn't thought about. And 2-3 years ago, my excellent student Sienna Bergt made the following comment, which I wrote down because I knew there would be an opportunity like this for me to share it with all of you. She said that Miss Birchfield is an antagonist representing compassion, but part of a critique of American optimistic attention yielding no resolution.
Good sentence.
In a Hollywood film, Miss
Yeah.
Birchfield would have been salvation.
That's what you're supposed to do.
He would have gone off with Miss Birchfield into some kind of a sunset. Now he is able to muster the energy to walk all of Manhattan, by the way. By the way, there's such a specificity of New York streets. You can tell this was made by New Yorkers. It wasn't shot in Vancouver. And there's a trajectory that he does walk from Uptown, 125th. He's at the Apollo, Nina Simone is playing, and then he works his way down to Lincoln Center.
Yeah,
And
you know, it's interesting. People don't realize Lincoln Center, that fountain had just been put there. It's very new. So what we look at is sort of iconic. At the time, Lumet popped in a new vista that didn't exist. And remember, he's going to visit Mrs. Birchfield. She's at like West End Avenue in 70th Street or something. That's where she basically is. And the Penn Railroads, because you can see the Penn Railroads from her terrace.
Yeah, but now you just touched on the other piece of Holocaust iconography that may or may not have been conscious on Lumet's part or Boris Kaufman's part. When he is sitting on Miss Birchfield's terrace, you actually, first of all, get a shot of trains moving in the background. You also, when he's in profile, you can see the bottom half of the frame is the terrace fence. It's the same kind of fencing that you see inside the pawn shop entrapping him. But way beyond in deep focus are smokestacks.
Yeah.
Like the Con Ed smokestacks.
Yeah.
But how do you not today look at that, especially on a second or third viewing? How do you not see the chimneys of the concentration camps?
Well, also it's set. Yeah, go ahead. Sorry.
No, just that this film has a kind of prescient quality in addition to visual richness in terms of codifying what would become over the next 20, 30 years. Holocaust representation.
But also another piece, which I wonder whether you said before, I love what you said, when he's walking in Harlem and he sees the shoes stacked up. At the time, you know, people, there was no Holocaust museum and there was no exhibits at Auschwitz, so we didn't know about this idea of stacks of shoes. But in that long walk that he takes, remember at one point he goes into the subway. And at one point he's basically filled with claustrophobia. He's having a panic attack. He's sweating. He tries to go between the cars, right? And I wonder whether you think in 1964, the audience was ready to see a crowded subway and understand that the flash cut of the crowded subway is being flash cut and superimposed by his son suffocating in a cattle car. He sees a New York City policeman in the cattle car, and he sees Gestapo, right? I mean, I wonder whether it was like the words too soon, right? Did people really fully understand what Lumet and Kaufman were doing?
Yes, is the simple answer. Because don't forget that there have already been flashbacks prior to this. The one of the concentration camp fence with Reuben, the one of the rings when the young woman is trying to pawn her rings, suddenly see the rings. And the third one was in fact when Mabel, the prostitute who is Jesus's girlfriend, comes to Sol and in the back says, "Look," pointing to her naked breasts. And that touches off the scene you described. "Look," says the Nazi officer to Sol in the concentration camp.
Great.
Pushing his head, shattering the glass.
Good one, Annette. I love that.
This final one in the subway car comes last.
I see.
And one of my students many years ago, a brilliant guy named Mark Huisman, wrote a paper in which he proposed that the flashbacks are not presented chronologically. In other words, first you see Reuben on the fence, then you see the rings, the dispossession, then you see the wife is already in the camp, and the fourth one, they're on their way to the camp.
Yeah.
And Mark Huisman suggested that it comes last because it's the least bearable for Sol.
Huh.
He needs to work through those other memories repressed before he can confront the worst of them, which is to lose his son in the cattle car.
Yeah.
And the way that scene is presented, it has such an inherent power, formally speaking. I'm not even touching yet what it means.
And also it goes to your, can I just interrupt you, sorry. It goes to your earlier word about helplessness, because the helplessness actually begins in the cattle car, right? He's not even in the camp. Imagine a man whose son is in his arms and then falls to basically get suffocated by an overcrowded cattle car. He died, he basically, you know, he dropped his son, and that was the last time his son was alive. We're not even in the camps yet.
You're right. And actually, when I rewatched the film recently, I noticed that in the very first scene, the first thing you're aware of is Sol's hands. He picks up his children, he has a wine bottle. Hands are crucial from the very beginning, and of course in the final scene as well. But the sort of uselessness of hands, the inability of hands to contain what they must, is of course part of what makes the pawnbrokers so powerful. So that train car, I've always found it a profoundly troubling sequence, a brilliantly directed sequence, and one that allows me into the psyche of a man in a way that no other scene could have. Dialogue wouldn't have done it. I mean, he has the dialogue to Miss Birchfield, what happened to you? What happened to you? I didn't die.
Yeah.
Everything I loved was taken from me. I didn't die. That's all he can say.
Yeah.
But this is the scene that graphically manifests that incredible sense of loss and inability to do anything about it.
And the speechlessness of it, the unspeakability of it, because when Sol finally tells this, what we believe over a sleepless night, he finally winds up in the terrace of Mrs. Birchfield. We assume at that point that we're seeing the flashbacks played out, that he unloads the whole story, right? I mean, I always assume that at that point he kind of told her everything. And it has that incredible, you know, where she starts off with this empathy story. At this point, she like reaches out to touch his hand, and he, you know, as if there's no way I could connect to you in any human, there's nothing I could possibly do that would connect to you in any human way, given what you just told me. I was wondering, I want to talk about two other scenes and get your sense of them. One is the one in the, it's people don't speak about it much, but it's the one in, is it the drug lord? Is it Rodrigo or Rodriguez?
Rodriguez.
Rodriguez. But that's Brock Peters, right? For those people who love To Kill a Mockingbird, that's Tom Robinson, who's the drug lord, right? So there's that really great scene when he's calling him professor, and Sol's very much feeling insulted by this. And he says, you were a professor, were you not? And what happens in that scene is that he finally brought the Rodriguez, what's his name? Sorry again.
Rodriguez.
Basically reminds him, why do you think you're in business in this pawn shop, taking $1 and $2 for baby booties and old oratory trophies? And yet you're paying for Tessie's apartment and your apartment, and you're paying probably for the house in Long Island. How do you think, well, no, what I want to say about this, Sol looks as if it never even occurred to him what he does for a living, right? That he's essentially a front for a criminal organization. He's a laundromat, he washes money. A Holocaust survivor is washing money by pretending to be a pawnbroker, because an African-American drug lord is basically hiding money in his safe. And it's as if this professor never figured it out. And I think that's a very profound idea, that how many years did that go on, that Sol didn't really do the math and figured out, how am I making a living with this chump change? And why is there so much money in my safe?
Well, two things. First of all, just a slight correction, because Sol Nazerman has no home. He doesn't have a home of his own. It was only on the third viewing of this film that I realized he's either staying at his sister-in-law's place on Long Island, or Tessie's apartment. We never see him in a place of his own, except for the pawn shop, if you want to extend it that way.
Okay.
And in that particular sequence, Rodriguez also counters, are you one of those who doesn't want to know? Is
Yeah.
that it? You know, in other words, it's not that Sol doesn't know, it's that Sol has engaged in a kind of willed blindness or myopia. And by the way, visually, it is extraordinarily well presented, because whereas the flash cuts, that montage of very rapid, had been primarily connecting past to present, expressing how the past was sneaking up on Sol and pulsating. Here it's used within the present tense, the way that they cut from Rodriguez, who's usually filmed from low angle, making him bigger, and Nazerman, who's usually filmed from high angle in his chair, making him seem smaller. It goes back and forth until at one point there's a close-up on Sol's face, and he's wearing different glasses from in the pawn shop. They're like this, without rims. They have a glare that his other glasses don't have. So at one point, his eyes are sealed off from us. All you see is the bright light in those eyes. That is an embodiment of his inability to see, of a certain kind of blindness.
Wow. Okay, that was good. I love that. I love that scene. It's good. I'm glad you took the bait on that, because let's talk about a couple other scenes that I think are interesting. The scene when the mobsters come in and they say, you know, professor or whatever, open the safe. And he closes the safe. And then they punch him. And he has that really great line where he says, what are you going to do? Kill me? So kill me. And the reason I think that's interesting is because later in the film, when we have again, a controversial scene, the stigmata scene, when he basically plunges his hand into the calendar, it is interesting of what's trying to be conveyed there. Here's a Holocaust survivor that tells us 10 minutes before that he's dead. You can't do anything to me that hasn't already happened. I hardly have anything to fear from you. And then we have this sort of, again, I know there's some controversy around this, maybe if you'd like to talk about it. The film, you know, has a kind of Christian ending. You know, Jesus dies, sacrifices himself. Jesus dies to save Saul. And it's only through that sacrifice does Saul, you know, start to feel, because it has that really, and I know you'll talk about this now, the iconic silent scream, which, you know, Sidney took credit for, and Steiger, everybody took credit for that incredible, where I think it's, what comes out of his mouth is Quincy Jones's trumpet, right? It's not actually a voice, a human voice. It's a sound of a trumpet. So I'm wondering, so the ending has a lot to say about life, physical life, that isn't felt and that is felt.
If this really were a, quote, Christian film, unquote, then there would have been something of a redemptive or a salvation moment. There would have been some sense of Jesus's death as meaningful for Saul or anyone else. This is a Jewish film. Forgive me, but the screenplay was by two Jewish men, if I remember correctly. Wait, I have their names. I shall tell you who they were, because that's
so you're saying you knew that argument. It just
David Friedkin and Morton Fine, right? And by the way, you know, it's a kind of sad thing that the novel by Walland was published in 1961 when Walland was 31 years old.
Yeah, he died the next year.
Died the next year at the age of 62. And by the way, you know that the novel is quite different.
Very different.
Film, especially the ending, which in the book is absolutely uplifting and redemptive.
I know, I hate that ending.
Saul is going to work with his nephew in the pawn shop.
I know, I hate that.
Really? In other words, it was a very Hollywood kind of ending for the book. The film goes dark and deep because it really goes further than most films I know in depicting not just an anti-hero or somebody who has lost the ability to act in a mature, manly way. It shows you a man destroyed by past and present. And when he puts his hand on that spike, mercifully off screen that he lowers it, I wrote in my book that he becomes a broken pawn because his body becomes a receipt. He has
Huh.
almost inherited a Nazi concept that only in the wounding of the body can there be some sort of feeling or meaning, which is quite problematic for me. But let's just go with the dramatic terms that the film presents for itself. When he walks away on Park Avenue, don't forget this is Spanish Harlem. I just want to, because I teach on 116th Street and Broadway. So I am aware that the Pawnbroker is set on the east side, Park Avenue and 116th Street, which is technically, or at the time was considered more Spanish Harlem
I,
than Harlem.
Annette, I'm sorry. I honestly thought it was 116th and Lenox.
No, no,
But
no. It
no,
says
okay.
Park Avenue, unless
Okay.
I'm completely wrong.
Yeah.
It says Park Avenue at the end, and we see him walking on
Okay.
Park Avenue. Now,
It's still east. I'm just saying
yeah,
the reason this is important to me is because I lived for many years on 120th and Lenox, and I always assumed I lived 4 blocks away from the pawn shop. I might have made
but
that up.
next time I see it, I'm going to look more carefully, but I'm 90% certain that Park Avenue are the two words that I see right there. In any case, to come back to the ending, he's swallowed up by the crowd. He leaves us. We
And
leave.
and he leaves the pawn shop open.
Yes. He at that point, even though one can make a great deal out of the iconography of Jesus and the scene of his death when the camera suddenly rises to a high angle and you actually see the shadow of bars descending on Jesus as he dies. It's both theatrical and cinematic. It's very moving, but you do not get the sense of resurrection. You do not get the sense that something good will come of this. And that kind of maturity and bravery at the end of a film is atypical.
So, okay, I like that. We haven't discussed that ending, and I've read you, but I'm happy. I'm happy with the way you've described that. I've always saw it as an ambivalent ending. Maybe I was playing too much into the actual novel, but he does. It does leave us with the question: what's next for Sol Nazerman? Was what he saw in the sacrifice of Jesus sufficient enough for him? And now that he's finally remembered, not maybe come to terms, but really taken in the information of how he lost his entire family helplessly, he's now ready to begin again, maybe with Mrs. Birchfield, maybe with Tessie. Let's go, before we take some questions from the audience, let's just one last question, which goes to something that you and I don't agree on. We agree on a lot of things, but here's something where we've been apart, which is that I have been very critical over the years of, the iconic Holocaust films. I've written pretty much negatively about every single one. There they go. Schindler's List, you name it. I haven't said nice things. There we go. Sophie's Choice, one of my least favorite films ever. And oh my God, I have so much to say about this film that I wrote about for the Wall Street Journal and received so much hate mail from Polish Catholics. So I have been critical of these. Oh my God, I can't stand this film. Somehow one thinks that if the Germans had only learned to read, they wouldn't have killed Jews. If they had just had more literacy. By the way, you should know, everyone, that Germany was the most literate nation on earth. So it's not about literacy that caused that. But if you saw that movie, that's what you'd think. Anyway, however, and I always felt that these movies trivialize the Holocaust. They never really tell the story of the Holocaust. They tell the story about rescuers, other outside parties like Sophie's Choice, like Oskar Schindler. They never get to the story. The Pawnbroker, I think you think, is the best of the Holocaust films. I don't know. I thought you've said that before. I think it's not even close. I think it's by far the best. But you are more charitable about all of them than I am. Maybe because you are the singular authority and I'm an amateur. But you have written the book on Holocaust films. In fact, I think in one of your, at the end of the last series of the books, you and I are even in discussion, arguing about something.
Life is beautiful.
Oh, Life is Beautiful. Oh my God, we can't even talk about that one. The title alone is nauseating. Can't have a movie called Life is Beautiful about it and call it a Holocaust film. That's just me. Anyway, so can we talk about, just for people like, and I'm mostly in the minority, let's face it. Most people love all of the movies we just discussed. You're more charitable, you see more in them. We have never agreed on this. Take us through this argument, and it is an argument. And the reason I'm raising this before I let you finish, there is a movie, a documentary that talks about, Annette wrote the book on Holocaust films, but there is actually a documentary called Imaginary Witness, Hollywood and the Holocaust, about the history of Holocaust movies in film and in theater. There's Charlie Chaplin and the Great Dictator. If you can find this movie, you should watch it. Among other reasons, Annette is in it. Even I'm in it. Steven Spielberg is in it. Sidney Lumet is in it. And Rod Steiger is in it. So given all of your friends from tonight will be in this movie. And it was directed by a good friend of ours, of Annette and mine, our friend Danny Anker, who died way too soon, tragically, way too soon. There's a picture of our friend Danny. I was able to do that, Annette, without getting weepy. That itself was an achievement. This discussion takes place in the movie, right? To some degree, the argument about should we even make these films, or is it transgressive to make these films? Is it a violation of some moral duty to the dead? Is also embodied in this film. Take us through the argument and your response.
I'll try, but we only have a few minutes left, and this is a discussion that could really go on for at least a half hour.
Let the audience know about let them debate it themselves.
Let me also, just so that they know which films were shown, because you didn't identify all of them. The next to the last one was The Pianist. We saw Adrian Brody, and the final one was The Reader, and we saw Kate Winslet.
And the other two were Sophie's Choice,
which you did mention.
Oh, I did, and of course Schindler's List with the girl in the red coat. Right.
So my approach to these films emanates from a very particular perspective. I'm a film educator. In other words, I don't bring to every motion picture I see an entire set of moral and ethical checkpoints. It has to be this, it has to be this, and then I'll give it my Imprimatur. I just try to see what is the film doing within its own terms, from the first shot to the last. Is it consistent within its terms? Is it persuasive? Does it present a vision? And then I can evaluate what that vision is, and I can argue with that vision. But, in the case, for example, of Sophie's Choice, I had read the novel, and one of my questions was, to what extent did Alan Pakula, the director, adapt it in a manner that I would call faithful to William Styron? I can have problems with the premise of William Styron's novel, but the way that the film was made struck me as profoundly effective, because we were made aware of how fallible a narrator Sophie is. In other words, when I would study the film with my students, we became convinced increasingly that because the entire film is told from the perspective of Stingo, a young Southern writer, at no point does the film say, this is the Holocaust, this is how it was. No, everything we see of Sophie is filtered through the imagination of the besotted Stingo. So I put that aside for a moment. And then I look at Schindler's List, let's say. Yeah, not only was I familiar with Thomas Keneally's book, a nonfiction novel that is basically interviews with those who survived under Schindler's protection and who otherwise would presumably have been murdered during the Holocaust. That was an inadaptable book. It's a series of interviews. And so I had to acknowledge that the shaping of it by screenwriter Steven Zaillian and the directing by Steven Spielberg gave it a kind of old-fashioned Hollywood narrative heft that certainly put, of course, the entire emphasis on Schindler as opposed to necessarily Jewish characters who are foregrounded. But how else was he going to reach an international audience? I mean, who of us really wants to identify either with a victimized Jewish character or an evil Nazi? You give me someone who starts off as a profiteering, mysterious, dubious sort of con charismatic artist, and then show me that he changes and he risks his money and his life to save Jews, you got me. You hooked me because that's a character whose emotional and moral trajectory I can engage in. So I tend to defend Schindler's List and other films insofar as I believe that they provide for viewers some kind of glimmer of Holocaust experience, never the totality, never the objective entire truth. Even documentaries can't do that. But motion pictures can sensitize. Even if they're trivializing or distorting certain aspects, they can play a great role in engendering awareness of a historical event. And those who wish to can go further. They can read the Warsaw Ghetto Diaries. They can do all sorts of things, but it's very often a motion picture that'll get them started.
All right, can I just say one last thing? I don't want to have the last word on that. I just want to just answer that last point, because remember, this is Annette, the great Annette Insdorf on this subject. To answer her last point, I would say most people learn their history from feature films. Most people do not have the intellectual curiosity to actually go, oh, wow, that's very interesting. Let me go find out more about that. That was never true, and it's even less true today. So I'm of the view that if you have $35 million to make a feature film, you also have a moral duty to tell the story in a particular way. And yes, I understand that you're not, it'll hook you, like you said, you got me. But I'm not sure that that one of the reasons to justify the films and to say, of course they're not a desecration, because it at least gives you a slice, a taste, and you'll go off and do some more work. I don't think so. I think you're going to walk away thinking the Holocaust is Anne Frank and Schindler's List. I got it. I figured it out. There's nothing more I need to know. All right, let's take, if you want to answer that, I would love for you to have the last word.
Let's let some people in.
Let's take some questions. Linda Moreno asks, by the way, Linda Moreno is now like my new favorite person. Are you ready for this question? She says, I saw this as a 12-year-old girl from the South Bronx, taken by my Cuban mother, who adored Rod Steiger. Come on, that sentence alone is just money. I love that. Then she says, can you address outside of the Holocaust and religion entirely uncomprehended by me as a kid, the sheer artistry of Steiger's performance? So here's a girl who said, my mom was a Steiger fanatic, and as a 12-year-old, she took me to see this film, and I think that's extraordinary that 12-year-old Linda Moreno watched this movie. Wow. From this, they lived in the South Bronx. This is a movie about Eastern Harlem, Spanish Harlem. Do you want to just say something in honor of Linda's mom about Steiger as an actor?
I think it's one of the most beautifully imploded performances of American cinema, because as most of you know, it's not that hard for an actor, even a non-professional actor, to explode, to do the big scenes, to yell. What's really hard is to control it and not let very much show, especially if you're playing a repressed character. So in Imaginary Witness, the documentary, Steiger actually says that when he was supposed to scream at Jesus's body, he opened his mouth and nothing came out. And he realized that it would be more effective if he uttered no sound than if he did scream, because the audience would place ourselves, we would do the scream for him. And by the way, I have no reason to doubt what he said. And I think it is also Sidney Lumet's greatness as a director that he left that in, that he did not, in fact, say, no, you have to scream. Sometimes it's the improvisational aspect that makes for greatness. And by the way, from there, I go further and I say that the mute scream became, for me, the emblem of the Holocaust survivor. Someone who witnessed devastation of such a scale that he is unable to utter it.
Also, it makes one think of Edward Munch's painting, right? That all we need to see is the face of a screamer. We don't actually hear the screamer. That's not that important. We know a man is screaming. And
Yes.
that has power anyway.
And by the way, my husband Mark just came in and gave me a little note. Of course, he reminded me that Steiger said that he had in mind for the silent scream Picasso's Guernica.
Oh, wow. Wow, wow. I
I
did
mean,
not know that.
that is, so rich on any number of levels.
Yeah.
But Rod Steiger already in On the Waterfront, playing the brother of Marlon Brando, he was fantastic at characters who repress their energies, who are seething, even whose clothing, whether it's in the Pawnbroker or in On the Waterfront, they're layers that keep him bottled in. We can't imagine these characters naked. They are clothed in layers that represent emotional layers as well. And I remember when he lost the Academy Award to Lee Marvin in Cat Ballou,
Unreal.
where that was the particular year.
It's
There
criminal.
was just, no, it could not be that an actor who gave a performance like this was not recompensed when Cat Ballou was. But that's another issue that I won't get into. But I think it's fantastic that your mother, took you at that age. And don't forget, there are so many secondary characters in this film, like the mother of Jesus, who was not an actress. That entire scene in the kitchen / bathtub, when Jesus is taking a bath and telling
She's learning English.
that was all improvised. There's
Yeah.
no such scene in the novel or the screenplay.
Yeah.
That's another mark of Lumet's genius too as a director.
All right, so that was from Linda Moreno. We'll take one more question, and then we'll do some housekeeping things to say good night, and then we'll thank our good friend, and really what I think was an extraordinary, successful first installment of Conversations on Essential Cinema. You really set the bar high there, Annette, but that's why you were our first one. This question comes from actually one of our board members, Brett Feeder. Brett Feeder asks, and Brett's a very smart guy, so I can see why he would ask this question. It's very profound. I hadn't thought about this question. Ready? I found the casting of Brock Peters as Rodriguez fascinating as an African-American man in a power role. I'd never thought about it that way. He says, what an incredible change from his Tom Robinson role in To Kill a Mockingbird in 1962. Remember, Brett Feeder's pointing out that this is 2 years after one of the most iconic roles of an African-American, injustice to an African-American, right? An illiterate African-American during the Jim Crow South. And then 2 years later, Brock Peters ends up being a sort of he's got the coolest apartment on Park Avenue in Harlem. Was there any thought about this, about Brock Peters? Like, we heard about Rod Steiger. What about Brock Peters from 1962 to 1964? He's a co-star in very significant films, as Brett points out, radically different roles, and in the first one, he's a powerful figure.
And in fact, if I'm just checking my notes from the novel. If I remember correctly, yep. In the novel, the gangster's name is Murillo and he's white.
Yeah.
So this was obviously a concerted decision, and I'm going to hold off for a moment on Brock Peters' genius as an actor. The part as conceived is also incredibly groundbreaking for its time. Namely, not only that Rodriguez is a powerful drug lord, it's that he has a white butler who's probably his lover. So yeah, if you watch the film again, the layers start to get unpacked. And there is, in that sort of depiction, an acknowledgement of a social structure that is not unlike the concentration camps. Forgive me, I'm not positing any sort of analogy between Harlem in 1963 and the Nazi camps of the early 40s.
But there was, people did make that association, and it was a controversial association.
Well, don't forget that what he is doing, Sol Nazerman, in that pawn shop, he's a kind of capo.
Yeah.
He engages in dispossession. In other words,
more importantly, he does it without feeling, right? He's unfeeling. He never even looks at their face, right? I think I love that African-American gentleman. He says, "You are a hard man," or somebody says, "You are a hard man, Mr. Nazerman."
Yes. Now he calls his customers scum, rejects, terms that were used vis-a-vis Jews during the Holocaust too. And his job is ultimately one of dispossession until we realize that his own survival depends on his servitude to Rodriguez.
Yeah.
It's a very complicated sort of social structure that, if you look at the store, at the pawn shop as replicating the storerooms of the concentration camps, then you start to question, so where is Rodriguez in all of this? And it's a fascinating question.
Right. Because, okay, go ahead. Yeah, go ahead.
Go ahead.
No, finish up. No. What I wanted to say is because this is a virtual film club, I really want to take another question because I want people to feel like they've really participated. This is our first one. And this is a question that is very, from somebody I know. She's very smart, lives out in Chicago. Is there anything meaningful? I was thinking of taking this because you touched on it a moment ago, Annette. Is there anything meaningful about the fact that the entire cast of the Pawnbroker is a melting pot of everything the Aryan Nazis were trying to eliminate?
Yes. The
this was from Brenda Feiss, my friend from Chicago.
Mixture of races, the ethnic blend. In fact, what I'm looking for right now, if I can find it, one of my students a few years ago at Columbia wrote an absolutely brilliant final paper about I found it, about the Pawnbroker. And if you'll allow me to, I think this may be a good way to conclude. This is Lauren Schwartz, and she wrote, "The pawn shop itself is the locus of much symbolic imagery. As a Holocaust survivor, Nazerman had all of his possessions taken from him, and consequently all the memories associated with those belongings. And now here he is taking the possessions, and we might argue memories, of those whose survival depends on pawning a family heirloom for a few dollars. These destitute individuals live on the fringes of society, and Lumet smartly casts people of all colors in these roles, reinforcing the fact that poverty knows no color in America.
Wow.
A young white pregnant woman, an elderly Hispanic lady, a lonely older Black man, each comes in with the hope that this time, maybe this time, they will receive remuneration for the item they are pawning that is commensurate with their pain in parting with it."
And it's also the sensitivities of the most private possessions.
Yes. And each time she says they leave disappointed. Last sentence, "In this way, the pawn shop functions metaphorically as a kind of frontier for the indigent, for whom the great American dream has turned out to be nothing but myth."
Whoa, good sentence.
I mean,
Wow.
believe me, when my students surpass the professor in terms of their perceptions and ability to articulate them, it's one of the great joys.
Well, thank you, Brenda Feiss, for that last question that got us that last paper from one of Annette's special students. All right, before we say goodnight, a couple of final announcements. First of all, this is our 4th live streamed virtual event during the pandemic. That's a lot of programming, all free as a public service from FOLCS. We are a nonprofit. Some of you have already responded to our request that you hope to donate to FOLCS, to go to folks.org, .org/donate. A number of you have responded, and we were very grateful to you. But if you value what we've been doing over the last 2 months, we are going to continue to do this, and our sense still is to keep it free of charge during the pandemic. If you can help us out, we're like all nonprofits. We've lost some revenue stream from live events, and if you can help us out, it would be helpful for us to guarantee that we can have more of this programming. Speaking of which, if you enjoyed tonight, spread the word. In a moment, I'm going to tell you about our second in the series of conversations on essential cinema. Sign up for a number of other events. If you're not already on our email list, go to folks.org and please sign up so you can receive announcements. Our upcoming events, May 19th, next week, we have an author talk with Ben Sheehan. And let's see that poster. This is, there we go. I want to see Ben Sheehan because of I don't know if I can read out. Yes, this is May 19th at 7 o'clock, and it's OMG WTF. You know what that means. Does the Constitution actually say? And we will be offering CLE credit if you're a lawyer. So there's some interest in that as well. That's May 19th. Register for that. On June 3rd is our next second our series of FOLCS Conversations on Essential Cinema. And guess what? We're showing another Sidney Lumet film. It's not because I asked it. The person we went to this is the actor Matthew Modine. Many of you know Matthew from such films as Full Metal Jacket, the Stanley Kubrick film, and Birdie, and Vision Quest, and The Band Played On, that incredible HBO film about the AIDS crisis, and more recently, the Netflix series Stranger Things. And in November, hopefully when Broadway reopens in some way, Matthew Modine is going to be on Broadway as Atticus Finch in To Kill a Mockingbird. So isn't that lovely, since Brett Feeder mentioned To Kill a Mockingbird, it comes full circle. The man who will be playing Atticus Finch in November, if Broadway reopens, will be our special guest. When I talked to Matthew, I said, what do you want to talk about? And he said, how about 12 Angry Men? I know one of the reasons for that is because Matthew once starred as juror number 4, which is the Henry Fonda role. I'm sure it is 4. I think it's 4. In a Los Angeles-based dramatic performance of 12 Angry Men, and he directed it. Isn't that interesting, Annette? He directed it and starred in the play. So I know that he has a thing for 12 Angry Men, and I wasn't surprised, and that would be Sidney Lumet's first feature film. So that's for June 3rd. And of course, for our aspiring filmmakers, our unbelievably successful series, the International Short Film Competition that FOLCS has sponsored now for a number of years. This is our 8th one. Annette was a judge for the first one, if I remember. This is our 8th one. We're having a call for entries, now accepting submissions for the 8th one, and it culminates in the International Short Film Competition FOLCS Awards Night, where we give out a special award called the FOLCSy. If you know any young filmmakers, aspiring filmmakers, please let them know about this, because it's really fun and great. Annette, we cannot possibly thank you enough. I'm sure you'll come back again. You've been a guest before. You are an incredibly invaluable friend, loving friend, and you are a treasure to the film community. Everybody knows it, and it is so true. And for those people who had not heard of Annette before or heard her, buy her books, read her books, follow her, check out the series Real Pieces at the 92nd Street Y. You will always be entertained, and you will always walk away smarter. And that's what we say happens here at FOLCS. So join us again. Come back again. We'll be here virtually, live stream. Good night, everyone.
Thank you.